the Radio Today podcast with Jen Seyderhelm.
Hello and welcome to Radio Today tonight, where Steve Ahern joins me for a list that's grown exponentially over the last week. On the table is Karl, Kyle, Kris and Jackie O. Audio listeners, I'll chat with Spencer Howson with his thoughts on the loss of more regional breakfast shows from the SCA Seven network, as well as the RCS Song of the Week. But to start things off, Steve, I have a question for you without notice. And this came from my conversation with Spencer Howson. I wonder this morning when you got up, what was the first news things that you went and had a look at?
I listened to news radio, so my news first comes to me as audio. Then I checked our websites, but then two websites, news.com and ABC.
So much the same for me. The first thing I did when I got up this morning was I wanted to know what the update was on the Karl Stefanovic situation, which we will talk about more this episode. But the other thing that I did was I checked the World Cup results, the Soccer World Cup results. And Spencer said, one of the listeners that he'd interviewed said, you have to remember that lots of us don't wake up and want to know local news. We want to know the big news things that are happening. And I reflected on that this morning with my own actions and realised I had done exactly that. I hadn't looked for anything that was locally specific. There were two particular things that I checked first up, one of which was global and one of which was national.
How interesting. And yet there's also over the years been established wisdom that people, especially in tough times like we're in at the moment, world geopolitics, people hunker down and focus on their local area. So very interesting to think when there's something like the World Cup on that you're looking globally.
Yes, and that starts me with the conversation of post-survey 3. The first thing that has happened in the last fortnight was that SCA Seven have commenced their job cuts. Now, initially, I thought, I don't know where I'd kind of got this impression, but I thought it was going to be a lot of behind the scenes and maybe some executive kind of stuff. But we saw the loss of 3 regional breakfast shows. WA one, the hit program that goes from Victoria all the way down to Hobart, and then the other one, Bronte and Lakey, that covers regional Queensland. Now, all of the eastern coast of Australia is now going to be covered by Jess and Rowan, who are doing the hit Newcastle show, which initially to me was sort of unfathomable. That's such a vast area that one breakfast show is covering. Steve, what are your thoughts on this?
I think it's a bad idea. I think it is, driven by money. When I asked Rowan Lund about that, the new CEO, about his regional teams, he was not at all committal that they would be immune from the economic decisions that he had to make. And that made me sad, really, because it seems to me he's thinking like a television person, because that was mostly his experience. And television programming and economic decisions, I think, are different from radio decision-making and programming. Radio is local, its cost base is smaller, and the connection with the community is closer. I really feel that an East Coast regional breakfast show, the one show that should be local in a market, it's doing a disservice to those stations to have that come from Newcastle. They do a good job in Newcastle, great show, but it's very hard to reach across the states, across the miles, across time zones, in this case not such a big deal, except in summer, and across the weather. I've had that criticism of Gold trying to do that with Christian O'Connell, and I would make the same criticism. I just think those things are decisions that are made based on economics of the moment, but they erode the connection of those radio stations with their communities. Those decisions come back and bite you in the long run.
That is why, for audio listeners, I'll chat with Spencer Howson, because Spencer is doing a incredibly interesting PhD on the value of regional radio to listeners. And from the conversations, and he's having big conversations with people on the ground of these communities. The insights out of it are fascinating, and one of which, and I really encourage you to follow along and engage with the journey, because the results, I think they're going to surprise him as well as many other people. But one of the questions he's asking is, where do you think your radio programs are broadcast from? And a surprising amount, more than I would have thought, think that it's local when it's not.
And that kind of counters my opinion in the sense that the technology and the tools now do allow you to sound local. So I recognize that. But there's a lot of value in walking down the street after your shift, going to your coffee shop or to get your hamburger and facing the people who've been listening to you in that town on that day. You lose that in the end if you're not in that town. I guess we're lucky in Australia that we have a very wide media landscape. So as well as commercial stations, we have the ABC and we have community radio. And perhaps it's a shifting where the community radio stations will take even more of that role and will become more important.
Yeah, and for us to watch ahead of when we catch up in a fortnight's time, we will have the Hobart survey, which will be impacted by these decisions. How much remains to be seen, but I find it fascinating that it's happened midway through a survey period, so we should see the results of that. And of course, what will be interesting to watch is Dan and Christy, the ones who are broadcasting from Hobart but going through regional Victoria and Tasmania, have started their own podcast. Now, this is a la, if you're following along these things, Ned and Josh from Canberra were let go from the hit station in Canberra, and they've been picked up for the Illawarra and for the Macarthur region, and they're doing breakfast for the next 2 weeks there. So their podcast that they started on the side when they were let go and made a daily thing has got them back into radio.
There's a whole change going on, and I think we're observing it right from the eye of the storm about podcasting. Of course, Kyle is leading it. Karl is also in the eye of the storm. But then, if radio hosts are let go and they've got something to offer, then they have another way of offering that. The one thing about that, of course, is the size of the audience and the commercial success of it to earn you money. But let's see what happens. We're, in this country, I think, reinventing the idea of podcasts and local radio, breakfast radio style. Tony and Ryan have done it hugely successfully, and they've taken their personality podcast to the world. So why not try it?
Yeah, and actually that's a really good segue to Karl and Kyle, because I saw Ryan John at a conference last year, and Ryan John said that he often gets people in the comments saying, why don't you speak to what's going on overseas and Trump and whatever? And Ryan said, gosh, I think he's smart. He said, no, I want us to be a place where people can escape that. That's not what we are. And we're not going to even try and be that. We are the escape from that. And my goodness, that's working. However,
that occurs to me, sorry to interrupt, but it occurs to me that if you only do a local breakfast show like you did on radio, that may or may not be successful. The audiences are smaller. But like Ryan, who just articulated a different position. They're not doing a breakfast show anymore. They're not doing a radio show. They've taken a position, and podcasting can allow you to take a position. Jack, the winner of one of the Australian Audio Awards with 1 minute remaining, where he interviews prisoners. He started thinking about taking his radio show to podcast, but then he honed it in on a particular interest he had. So I do think there's an element that you have to shift if you're going to make that strategic decision to take what was a radio show to a podcast. And you've got to work out what is your niche audience in podcasting that you're going to speak to. And that the Tony example, the Tony and Ryan example and Jack's example are very good ones of people who've done that and had success. Sorry, I cut you off. What was your point?
Well, I'll just add that Mark Fennell, who also won awards at the Australian Audio Awards, is exactly the same. And he's in the position now where people are coming to him saying, do you know about this? And he's like, well, there's an idea for the next series. And it snowballs. It's really wonderful to witness the evolution of these people who've come from radio, TV to become tremendously successful podcasters and TV.
And one of the secrets of success there is, and I'm speaking to you, all you people leaving radio and thinking of a podcast, here's one of the secrets of success. Once you've worked out what is your specialist topic, feed the metadata, because the difference between radio and podcasting is people can find you by your topic. On radio, you have to find the station by the format. Gold is clear format, good name. Whatever is the format, people find that and then they find you. But they find podcasts differently. They search it by either direct search, because someone's recommended it, or I'm interested in radio or in sport or whatever, and I'm searching for a podcast. So get the metadata right, figure out what's your specialist focus or multiple focus, and feed the metadata so that you can be found.
Agreed. Adding into the metadata and the podcasting world is now Karl Sanderlands, although how he's described it doesn't yet really specifically sound podcast per se. It sounds like a video show, but it'll probably sit under the podcast in inverted commas umbrella. So that was among the other big news this fortnight, is that Kyle settled with ARN and now he's off on his own trajectory. He's still somewhat tied to ARN, who have taken a cut of whatever the profits are. He will do the Karl Sanderlands show, which sounds very similar to the Karl Stefanovic's show. I think it's Karl Live. Kyle Live is what it's being called now, but it will be in his own vision. And the other two things that were really notable from the announcement that, or the conversation he had with Game Changers podcast about settling, was one, his connection to Pauline Hanson, which we'll come back to via another connection to Pauline Hanson that's happened this week, but two, that he's back in touch with Jackie O. And I feel like you and I both know Kyle well enough to know that none of these things would have been said without forethought of how they would land.
Yes, I think that's right. And great credit to Irene and Craig on Game Changers. That was a really interesting, insightful, timely interview, and Kyle purposely chose to deliver that there. So we've now got the news from Kyle's mouth about that, and you're dead right. He thinks about things strategically. He's got a really good radio programming format and publicity brain, Kyle, and he does think about these things. I think he definitely wanted to make sure that everybody knew that he is sorry for things that he said to Jackie over time, and he wants reconciliation. It seems like Jackie may be open to that, but she needs a bit of time from the way that she's been quoted. And, of course, she's still running her court battle, which is a very different case from Kyle's. It's a Fair Work case. So she has various legal constraints on what she can say too, but she's keeping a low profile. I think going back to that eye of the storm, Australia reinventing the world of podcasts. In America, Serial was the first podcast series to capture public attention and let people understand what a podcast was. Then came Joe Rogan, who really took the tradition of the Howard Stern talk show onto the podcast medium. And then there's Mel Robbins, who does a similar sort of thing, female skewed, in America. So America's a bit ahead of us in using leading high profile personalities to drive traffic and and visibility to the podcast medium. I think Kyle's going to drive that here no matter what he does. As you said, sounds like a live breakfast show video podcast, if you can call a live video show a podcast, and, a cut down, catch up version on all the podcast platforms. If anyone is going to drive an audience, a mainstream audience to podcasting, to make the total podcasting audience bigger, it will probably be Kyle. So we watch this space. Of course, Karl and Eddie might also have something to do there too.
I totally agree. We watch this space, but then, Kyle and Karl are friends, Karl Stefanovic. And just as Kyle's news was still in the ether and we were all talking about it, along came Karl. Now, Karl has kicked off his Gold, the long weekend show with Eddie McGuire, which is on radio, on iHeart, on 9 Now, and I think it's Stan as well. You went, by the way.
I did. I went to the first live show a couple of weeks ago at ARN's studios in North Sydney. It was set up as they do for their various live concerts with a stage and chairs, but there were more cameras and more lights. So there was a television element in it, capturing the last hour, not the whole program, but the last hour. They came down from the studio. They were there in front of a live crowd and invited trade media like us. To me, the most significant thing that I observed was the power of both of those personalities to just connect with an audience. I thought Eddie was a huge connector and he really knows how to work an audience. When they first came down, they both went on the stage at first, but then there was a bit of time while the news was on and the music was on. So Eddie just unplugged himself and went down the middle aisle and he was saying hello and where are you from and who are you and why are you here? Nice to see you, shaking hands. And soon after, when they were on air, the crowd was going, Eddie, Eddie, Eddie. He's a powerful personality and he really made a connection. Karl was a little more reserved, I think because he's not as comfortable in the radio medium. He's new to radio. Eddie's very experienced on radio, so he was comfortable. But Karl was sitting back thinking about, I guess, what would be the next thing. He did have a chat to some of the audience, especially when he saw Eddie doing it. But the connection, that personal connection with the audience wasn't as evident with Karl as it was with Eddie in that first show. I think Karl probably has a little bit of work to do to learn how radio people relate to their audience, which is very personal. Over the years, I've done a lot of training, and what I train radio people to do is think of that mic as one person, your favorite person, and speak individually to that person. When I train people on television, it's very different because you have to look into that camera. You have to imagine your audience. Yes, you kind of look into the barrel of a camera if you're a newsreader, but if you're not, you don't look in the camera. That kind of breaks the magic of it. So people who come from television take a while to realize that you need that one-to-one connection. It's not, hello, I'm Karl on the Today Show with all my millions of people watching. It's, hello, I'm Karl, and you are? One-to-one audience.
Yeah. Well, the other thing that I think Eddie has an advantage is the AFL connection. He's speaking with fans all the time. He's got that connection. And you can't underestimate the power of that sporting heritage for him as well, whether or not you love Collingwood or don't love Collingwood. It's a talking point and he's so good at it. He really is so good at that too. So that's a whole picture of person who's worked in many different spheres that makes up the entire person.
Yeah, very much so. It was interesting also at that show. Karl was representing Brisbane, his home state. He talked often about sport in Brisbane. He talked a bit about Sydney sport, and Eddie brought the Melbourne sport. So if anything is going to unite that show across the eastern states, it will be sport, and everyone was included. So that was a very big positive, I thought, in the strategy when talking sport in that show. And they did talk a lot of sport because that's part of the feel of it, you know, the long weekend, winding down to the weekend. You've knocked off work early, chatting with your mates, playing a bit of music and talking about the things that are happening. And it could work. I don't know yet if it will work as a radio show, but that hour cut down certainly worked as a 1 hour catch-up TV show. So maybe it'll work.
My thoughts on it is that a good product in the wrong place. I used the analogy of tomato sauce on ice cream. But this point all may be moot because subsequent. So trying to make this big story smaller. So Karl Stefanovic has his own independent podcast. He released an episode with the controversial guest that was taken down, no one knows by who, replaced by a much safer episode featuring Ant Middleton. And then the next morning, it was uploaded to Pauline Hans's Please Explain platform with a description at the top that basically suggested that Nine was looking to sack her dear friend Karl Stefanovic and had a little dig at Deb Knight, God knows why. And anyway, oh my goodness, didn't that start the ball rolling of what the implications were going to be? So as of where we stand right now, it appears that Karl has either been sacked or has resigned. It appears that he's going to still get his final 6 months of his contract's wages. None of that can be sorted out until Karl returns from he's on leave at the moment from the Today Show, so he's in the UK. None of it can be resolved. To do that
Tommy Robinson interview.
Yes, the Tommy Robinson. So none of it can be resolved. So if he has indeed been sacked / resigned, what does that mean for Friday's show with Eddie? Yeah. What does it mean for this Friday show or the show going on? Because if Karl is overseas at the moment, it would be 3 a.m. in the morning that he'd have to record that show to do this Friday's episode if they're actually doing it live, which I think was the point of what they were trying to do. But will it continue?
Yes, I wonder. It's, ARN would have to be just keeping their heads down, thinking, well, in the words of Michael Stevenson, the brand safe risk of Kyle has been settled, and ARN did a very good job of settling that and could now say to their advertisers, come back to us. And yet here is another K for Karl, creating another brand safe risk. There's so many elements to that. I think nowadays we have to be aware of the kind of audience response that we might get. So brand safety is an issue for advertisers. We've got the Mad Witches group out there as a consumer lobby group. They were spot on it straight away. Consumer advocacy lobbying against advertisers has been a huge thing in America for years, along with court action. Thankfully, that kind of consumer court action doesn't happen so much in Australia because we have different laws. But the Mad Witches are a lobbying advocacy group, and they are highlighting risk and targeting advertisers about brand safety. And they've now decided that Karl is another target for them. On that, over the last few months, I've been reading the Mad Witches posts. I totally agree. We live in a very rich media society. People should be able to object to objectionable things, and that group is doing what it can do to call out bad behavior. So I'm all for that. But as I've been reading their posts, the language is very bullying language, aggressive language, and that also sits uncomfortably with me, as does some of the supposed journalism in the case of Karl interviewing Tommy Robinson, or the bad behavior of Kyle. So I just wonder, do you do one bad thing to correct another bad thing, or is there a better way of doing it if you're a consumer advocacy group?
Yeah, my mother's saying about two wrongs don't make a right.
Yeah. There's another element to the Karl Tommy Robinson interview. I listen around the dial and listen to podcasts a lot because, number one, on Radio Info and Radio Today, we need to know what's going on. But number two, people pay me to air check them all around the world. So I'm constantly listening. And yesterday I was listening to Ellen Fanning on ABC Brisbane Drive. She's a great broadcaster. She's doing a fabulous job there in Drive. But she's also a highly credentialed media person. She used to lecture in media. She's got the runs on the board. And she had a really interesting conversation with a UK correspondent. And they were talking about responsible journalism.
The dilemma for legitimate journalists then is there is a public interest in listening to and interviewing and testing the ideas of somebody who is this influential. But at the same time, you can't be in the business of rebroadcasting known falsehoods. That's misinformation.
Yeah, look, it's something that we think about all the time as journalists, isn't it? Is our role there to just kind of neutrally report on them? Is it our role to unpick them, to analyse them and explain the falsehoods? Or is it best for us to just ignore them and show that, you know, there is no legitimacy to them by doing that? I think it's a really difficult thing for journalists to do. What you absolutely don't do is just do softball interviews where you allow people to just spout claims without challenging them at all.
I really liked the way she defined it because, you know, you can go too far the other way. You can silence people's views. And when you silence people's views, like we're seeing in the UK, you know, if people feel like they're not being heard, they have to feel like they take angry action to get their message heard. So I don't think media should be silencing people. But if we choose to give people a platform, then it's our responsibility to ask the hard questions and put the hard questions, challenge the untruths, and make sure that if you're a responsible journalist trying to do a responsible kind of interview program, that you have not given a soft interview. If you're a social media influencer who everyone knows, you know, that your opinion's been bought or whatever, that's a different thing. But if you position your show as a journalistic style of show, then the responsibility falls on you to ask the hard questions. It doesn't mean you have to be personally insulting to the person. It doesn't mean you have to go hammer if they don't ask the question. It just means you've got to put the question intelligently to counter their point of view and to let the audience know that there is another way of looking at this separate from the point of view of the person you're interviewing. Ellen had a really good conversation about the craft of journalistic interviewing.
Oh, I hear all what you're saying, but I suppose in rebuttal of that is that what's been fascinating, and we talked about Howard Stern earlier, is that Howard Stern also was always a pot stirrer, but because he's got himself into so much trouble, he's become more and more safe. I don't know if you're like, he really
Absolutely. I've been listening, and I think I mentioned it a couple of times in articles that I wrote about Kyle and his inspiration from Joe Rogan and Howard Stern. And Howard Stern's show was like the Kyle and Jackie O show until he went to Sirius, and then he got more extreme in the pranks and the awful things that he was doing. But over the years, he's moved on from that. And that's the secret of longevity in any media performer. You have to reinvent yourself. John Laws did it all the time. Every decade he reinvented himself. And Howard Stern has reinvented himself because he found that circus act no longer worked, and the audience has changed, and people understood that it was more offensive and weren't tolerating it. So he started to think, okay, what's important to me now? Well, what's important is to learn the views of these interesting, controversial people who I can interview. His show now is very much long-form interviews. Joe Rogan's the same. Joe Rogan is very schizophrenic, in my opinion. I've listened to a lot of Joe Rogan trying to work out what's the secret of success. When he doesn't have an interesting guest, then he is also a kind of a crew show where they talk nonsense, unsubstantiated fact, yet it's kind of entertaining, but I can't listen to that. It's nonsense. But when he does an interview with someone of substance, then he's clearly intelligent and asks good questions and challenges them, and it's worth listening to.
Then the other side of the argument is it worth giving a platform to these controversial people to just speak to them without an agenda to see what happens? But we are becoming more and more of a society where we expect there to be a hard question or an outcome. It can't just be a conversation, which has been one of the polarizing things about Karl's chat with Tommy, is could they just chat about things? There was an agenda to that one, but that brings me to where we stand right now. So Karl will have his podcast. Kyle will have his podcasty thing. And dare I say it to you, Steve, those two alpha males are really competing for the same guests and very similar audiences at the same time. And how fascinating is that? The other thing I have to mention that we haven't said so far is that neither of them have the legal backing of a radio or a television network anymore. So they have to be so much more careful because they don't have that person who's like, oh, nope, stop, don't do that because this will happen and whatever. And now when they say really contentious things, there are repercussions in terms of legal activity.
That's such an important point, and you're absolutely right. I mean, in a lot of cases, you can get away with things that are not legal by editing the podcast, the replay or whatever. But if you're live and if you're defaming someone or saying something bad, then it's gone out there. And you're right. You know, when they worked for big organizations, they have fantastic legal teams that you can check with. I agree with you. There's a huge risk. I think the biggest risk is defamation, because in this country, if you defame someone and it's published, there's three elements to defamation: publication, reputation, identification. So if you hit all those elements in a live show on YouTube and that live show is being watched by 500,000 people, then if you take it down or edit it, you may have satisfied the requirements of YouTube or the podcast platform you're on, but it doesn't mean that the defamation didn't take place. So in Australia, you can be sued, and yes, they'll both need a pot of money to defend defamation actions if people decide to go at them for serious defamation.
And the Mad Witches are watching, and they're watching closely. So it's not the no-risk entity for either. And on top of that, what I can see happening next, I half wondered today whether or not we might see the Kyle and Karl podcast, right? The two of them joining together. But I just think they're two alphas that couldn't do that together for any long-term proposition.
Yeah,
however,
interesting. And yet they're friends, and, you know, they have done short-term things before, but yes, it's about sustaining it every day. On the risk side too, I asked people last week, leaders in the industry, about whether they thought Kyle's live show and podcast would be successful. And most of them didn't want to go on the record. Lots of them told me what they thought, but they didn't want it published. But Graham Mott went on the record, and I thought he nailed it on the pros and cons of Karl Sandilands. And I characterized it as the 3 R's: ratings, revenue, and risk. He said, no doubt Kyle, with his huge personality, brings an audience, brings ratings, and revenue follows, even though there was risk to it, and some advertisers were risk averse. There's lots of advertisers who like the risk. I spoke to Lauren Joyce about this last week. She said, I could quote her, but, you know, we didn't write it up as a story. But she also talked about the fact that when she was there at ARN, there were many advertisers who ran a mile from Kyle's program after the Mad Witches campaign. But there were others who really wanted to be associated with the edgy style show. There's pros and cons of that risk as well. And if you get the right balance, then revenue follows. So you're talking about ratings, revenue and risk in those 3 R's when you're evaluating.
Well, if both of them have built their propositions from what have started with Pauline Hanson in both instances, then both of them, I don't imagine that the same advertisers are going to literally have the funds to support both. So it's going to be really interesting there, because I really do think that they're competing, and I don't know if they've clocked to the fact of the competition, or maybe Karl Stefanovic really has, and that's why this week has happened. We will see. I have a speculation for you to wrap up this show. So the other thing that happened over this fortnight, which we have mentioned so far, is that Jackie O is persisting with her case against ARN. We don't have a lot to go on here because Jackie O has really gone to ground. There are additional elements to it, but I read somewhere that she hasn't actually been in touch with ARN, right? So she's really gone to ground and removed herself from any voice to the conversation whatsoever. Then Kris Fade, who is working over in Dubai for Virgin Radio, announced that he had been offered Kiss breakfast, but he had turned it down, which Steve, you and I first alluded to, maybe 6 weeks ago, maybe 2 months ago now. So that happened.
Yeah, and isn't that interesting in the way that he said he had turned it down? He said he'd signed a 1-year contract in Dubai. And, you know, if you blow up a show, the person who comes in to fill the chair is always going to get the backlash. So you don't want to be the first person to fill the chair, but maybe a year after, you might be happy to do it. You were there at the conference and heard Kris Fade talking about that. Have you got any connections with Kris and any insights into his recent thoughts?
Well, I don't believe that the conversation had started with ARN then. I think that the ball started rolling after we chatted about it. He has worked for ARN beforehand. They know who he is. And I like him. He's a great broadcaster, and my personal opinion is he is the right person for the job, which ARN has obviously agreed on. I have a speculator for you, though, further to this. There were 2 other little interesting tidbits to it. First of all, Kris said, not yet, right? Mm-hmm. So I don't believe that this conversation is over at all yet. But the other thing that I have reflected on, the only statement that Jackie O has actually made is that she is not willing to work with Kyle Sandilands anymore. So Kyle, who I also believe in his kind words about his reconnection with Jackie cannot work with him because her legal case is based on the fact that she can't, right? And I think that Kyle knows that she's the missing link to what he's doing now. He needs a Jackie. He really does. It made the show. Whether you were a fan of Jackie, a fan of Kyle, or whatever, the 2 of them together were a bigger sum than the individuals. I think that what ARN was hoping for was Kris Fade and Jackie O. And Jackie O has not come to the party yet because she's really pissed with ARN. And I think that's what we're waiting on.
Interesting. Look, it makes sense. It's good speculation.
Well, remember they offered her an opportunity to work in the future.
Absolutely. That was, of course, before she sued them. So, you know, those sort of things may change your willingness to work with people. But, you know, it happens in the media all the time. It could happen. And I agree with you. I think they would be a good pairing.
I would listen to that show, Steve. I genuinely mean that. I think it's the right thing for what the KISS network stands for. Let's start it in Sydney. Let's leave Melbourne alone and just make it Kris and Jackie O in Sydney, which they are both from. Kris really stands for Western Sydney, which is, again, what I always symbolise KISS 106.5 with. It's just some things haven't been ticked in the boxes yet.
On that basis, give it time. And Kris is giving it time if he ends up back here. And Jackie is giving it time, hopefully for everybody's sake. Whatever end to that court case is going to happen, that it will happen by the end of this year. They're scheduled for court in October. They may settle before. 10 days in October should get it all out there. The only question will be how quickly the judge will then hold on to make a decision. As I've declared before, I was the expert witness about radio for the court in the Karl case. Now that that case has finished, I'm free to talk about what I wrote, and I wrote about ratings, but I also wrote explanations about the kind of dynamics between team shows, generators and reactors, the cast member in a team who feeds the joke, and then the one who sets it up, and then the one who plays off that, and then the one to laugh. There's a whole lot of craft behind the scenes that people don't know. They don't need to know. They're just listening to a good radio show. But when it's really working, there's great craft to it. And I wrote some expert reports to explain to the judges and the lawyers how that worked. I'm going to talk about that at Radio Days Asia later this year.
Oh, that will be really interesting, because so much, I suspect, will happen before that date to continue this conversation on. But I wonder if it's going to get to October. I wonder if that's going to be also...
I always think most people don't win out of court action. So I hope, for the sake of Jackie, for ARN, the company, and Karl and everyone concerned, that it's settled in a way where everyone can walk away with something, and more importantly, just feeling good about themselves, because going through any court process is not a good feeling. So faster you get it over with to a satisfactory result, the better.
I think that will do us for this episode. Thank you, as always, for a great chat, Steve. And I'm going to catch up with Spencer Howson. Spencer, what do you think are the implications for regional, local breakfast shows on radio going forward?
One of the things that I'd always assumed, I suppose, having worked in local radio myself and having hosted a local radio show for many years, was that, as the radio industry likes to say, radio is at its best when it's live and local. So I just always assumed that absolutely, completely the case. And then I started seeing these instances around Australia, in regional Australia, where a network's hit breakfast show was actually the most listened to show and not a local breakfast show. And there are lots of examples of that. And if we just draw a line in the sand at last week for a moment, pre-last week, when we had a Queensland hit show, Tasmania Victoria hit show, and the New South Wales hit show. And I've been spending quite a bit of time looking at Queensland and Victoria, and in Mount Isa, Toowoomba, Emerald, Roma, even Townsville. In all of those places, the number one most listened to breakfast show at the last survey was the hit network hit breakfast show. And in Victoria, you've got a similar situation. So having noticed that in a lot of regional Australia, the most listened to breakfast show is not a local show, I guess I started thinking, well, maybe the radio industry will look at this and say, we don't even need a Queensland-based show. We don't even need a Victoria and Tasmania show. We don't need a New South Wales show. How about we just have one show for the whole country, and can the same thing be achieved? And so I started this journey a couple of years ago. And then last week, I talk about drawing a line in the sand. Last week, then we see the Christian Dan show in Hobart, the Bronte and Lakey show up on the Gold Coast in Queensland, axed. And we indeed hit an hour, putting the Jess and Rowan show from Newcastle across New South Wales, Victoria, Tasmania, and Queensland. And I think that I'm going to predict, but I'm not always right with my predictions. I'm learning that. I thought in Mildura that Dan and Chrissy would be number one when the Mildura results came a couple of weeks ago, and the local Triple M show with Matt Man was number one. But I think that that Rowan and Jess from Newcastle can continue to be number one, can maintain that number one most listened status for hit in a lot of the market that they are serving. And then if that happens, how long until hit says we can do this nationally? I know you've got the time zone, but the content that Christian, Dan, and Bronte and Lakey and Rowan and Jess are doing can easily be played out 2 hours later or 3 hours later in WA, and then you have the local news stories in the news. So I wouldn't be surprised if in the next 2 years, Hit says, all right, we're going to have one national regional breakfast show. They seem to make these changes every couple of years. And like in Queensland, Bronte and Lakey had only been on for 2.5 years, because before that, there was a show from Townsville that went to regional Queensland, but the Gold Coast had its own. 2 years ago, they said, well, how about all of Queensland takes the Gold Coast? And that's proved to be a success in a lot of places, including Townsville, literally Townsville. And then if Hit can show that it can be done, it's already, in WA, it's sort of gone that way with its Triple M network as well. How long before that's what Resonate does and ARN does and the ABC? And, how long until we have essentially, a lot more national and networked breakfast and far fewer local breakfast.
Thank you to Spencer Howson. Finally, the RCS Media Monitor's National Radio Airplay Chart Song of the Week. And it's at number 1 this week from Josh Farwer, who's gone to number 1 after just 10 weeks in the charts. He's an Aussie producer, very much in the vein of DJ Cyril last year. He's taken Madonna's Like a Prayer and added a real electronic dance beat to it. This week, it had 1,037 spins on radio.
In the midnight hour, I can feel your power, just like a prayer. You know I'll take you. When you call my name, it's like a little prayer. I'm down on my knees. I wanna take you.
That's it for me. Thanks to Steve Ahern. We'll catch you next time.
Radio Today with Jen Seyderhelm. Find more at radiotoday.com.au.
radiotoday.com.au